August 1945, Tokyo. The air is thick, unmoving, trapped between blackout curtains and the heat of late summer. Inside Imperial General Headquarters, the war is measured in paper, typed reports, hand-drawn maps, lists of fuel allocations that shrink every week. Men in uniform stand over documents as if staring long enough might force them to align into something manageable. The home islands have been burned again and again, yet the machinery of command continues out of habit and necessity. Then the message arrives that does not behave like the others. Hiroshima is not reporting back. At first it sounds like another raid, another city hit, another night of fires. But the details refuse to settle. One aircraft, one detonation, an entire urban center erased in a single moment, not gradually, not by waves of bombers, but by an event so abrupt it leaves only absence. For years, Japan's military has told itself that endurance is a weapon, that suffering can be absorbed and transformed into leverage. But now, in the stillness of this room, a different understanding begins to form. The war has crossed a boundary they did not know existed, and the language of resistance may no longer apply. That boundary was reached only because Japan had already been pushed to the edge long before atomic power entered the conflict. By the summer of 1945, Japan's war effort was running on diminishing reserves. The empire still held territory, still fielded armies, still issued orders with formal authority. But the deeper system, fuel, shipping, production, training, had been steadily dismantled. The strangulation began at sea. From 1943 onward, American submarines expanded their campaign against Japan's merchant fleet, turning shipping lanes into corridors of loss. Oil tankers became the most valuable targets because they carried the one resource Japan could not replace. By 1944, the shortage of fuel was not an inconvenience. It was a structural failure. Warships stayed in port because they could not be risked on limited supplies. Aircraft training hours fell because aviation gasoline could not be spared. Transportation across the home islands slowed as rail networks competed for increasingly scarce fuel and maintenance. This maritime collapse had a compounding effect. Japan's industrial base depended on imported raw materials, iron ore, bauxite, rubber, oil. When ships did not arrive, factories could not operate at capacity, even when they survived bombing. The war economy began to fracture not only under attack, but under starvation. In the air, the imbalance grew sharper. The United States was producing aircraft at a scale Japan could not match. Even when Japan achieved tactical successes, they rarely translated into lasting advantage because American losses were temporary. Machines and crews returned, damage was repaired, new squadrons arrived in waves. Japan's pilots, by contrast, were becoming a finite resource. Training pipelines narrowed as fuel disappeared and experienced instructors were lost. Aircraft were flown longer than intended, repaired beyond reasonable limits, and kept operational through improvisation rather than supply. Strategic bombing then pushed the crisis into the home islands. U.S. long-range air power expanded, and by early 1945 the bombing campaign intensified in ways that aimed not just at factories, but at urban industrial ecosystems. Incendiary raids, low altitude, high volume, turned wooden cities into firestorms. The Tokyo raid of March 1945 demonstrated a terrifying efficiency. An entire capital could be burned in a night. And yet, even as cities disappeared under smoke, Japan's leadership interpreted bombing through familiar logic. Bombing destroyed infrastructure. It killed civilians. It weakened production. But it did not, in their view, decide wars on its own. A nation surrendered when its armies were defeated, when its political structure collapsed, or when invasion made continued resistance impossible. That belief mattered because it allowed an exhausted military to keep its central plan intact, hold out, absorb damage, and impose such costs during invasion that the enemy might negotiate. By mid-1945, Japan's strategy narrowed toward one desperate concept: a final defense of the home islands. If American forces tried to land, Japan would make the price unbearable. The decisive battle would not be won through maneuver. It would be won through casualties and political shock. This was the world Hiroshima entered, an empire already weakened, already burning, still clinging to endurance as its last instrument of strategy. And beneath that endurance lay a deeper misreading. What America's industrial and scientific system was capable of producing. Japan did not underestimate America's wealth. It underestimated the speed with which wealth could become power. Reports from Europe and the Pacific described American shipyards launching vessels at rates that seemed impossible, factories producing aircraft in numbers that overwhelmed any tally. Japanese intelligence was aware of the imbalance, but awareness did not automatically produce comprehension. Within Japan's command culture, war was still framed as a contest of will and sacrifice. Industrial output mattered, but it was treated as one factor among many. Endurance, national cohesion under pressure, was assumed to be decisive. The idea that a superior system could compress time, replacing losses so quickly that strategy itself became one-sided, was difficult to internalize. This gap widened further when it came to science. Japan had talented physicists and engineers, and it understood the theoretical importance of atomic research. But theory was not the same as production. Building a nuclear weapon required enormous industrial coordination, energy supply, and specialized materials. Japan lacked much of that capacity by late war, and what existed was under constant threat from bombing and blockade. Because Japan could not realistically build such a weapon within the wartime time frame, many leaders assumed no one else could either, at least not in a usable form before the conflict ended. Warnings and scattered intelligence hints existed, but they competed with immediate crises: food shortages, coastal defense, fuel allocation, and the daily reality of air raids. Another constraint was institutional division. The Army and Navy were not operating under a unified strategic mind. The Army focused on the home islands and ground forces, preserving units for the expected invasion defense. The Navy, already shattered, had a clearer view of industrial imbalance, but limited power to redirect national policy. Coordination was poor, and a shared understanding of threat was harder to build in a system already under stress. Meanwhile, the civilian experience was reshaping the environment in which decisions were made. Firebombing didn't just destroy buildings, it displaced workers, shattered transport systems, and collapsed local governance. The separation between front and home dissolved. The war was no longer somewhere else. It was inside every city, every ration line, every train station. Even so, surrender remained politically and culturally explosive. Many leaders believed that prolonging resistance might preserve the imperial system and prevent unconditional occupation. Their calculations were not purely military. They were existential and institutional. So Japan entered August 1945 with a plan built on endurance, a hope that invasion could be made costly enough to force negotiation, and a belief, quiet but persistent, that no single weapon could end a war without conquest. Hiroshima shattered that belief, not because destruction was new, but because the method and scale did not fit the logic of endurance. And once the bomb's meaning began to take shape, Japan's military was forced to examine it from multiple angles: operational, technological, psychological, and moral, each one stripping away another layer of the old world. Japan's defense planning depended on time. Aircraft could be intercepted. Fleets could be delayed. Even a devastating raid usually came in waves, allowing alarms, dispersal, repair, and adaptation. Hiroshima offered none of that. One aircraft appeared, one device fell. An entire city ceased to function. Command posts vanished. Communications broke. Fire spread with no recognizable pattern of ignition. The event did not resemble a campaign. It resembled an instant erasure. For a military built on the idea that resistance could be organized and expressed, this was destabilizing. If such a weapon could be delivered repeatedly, then no coastal defense, no air defense, no concentration of forces could protect the nation. The concept of decisive battle depended on the enemy having to come close. Atomic delivery suggested the enemy might never need to. Bombing had grown more destructive throughout the war, but it remained a chemical process. High explosives and incendiaries had limits governed by conventional physics. Hiroshima indicated something different: a release of energy outside the known scale of chemical weapons. Japanese scientific observers and engineers who studied early reports recognized key features: a blinding flash, extraordinary heat, a pressure wave of unusual character, and later, patterns of sickness that did not match burns or trauma alone. Even without full data, the implication was unmistakable. This was not simply a bigger bomb. It was a different category of force. Once that category existed, it could be replicated, refined, and potentially stockpiled. The terrifying question was not what happened once. It was what could happen again. Japan's war culture had elevated endurance and sacrifice into strategic values. Soldiers were trained to accept death as a form of resistance. Civilians were urged to endure bombing as proof of national will. But atomic destruction made endurance feel irrelevant. In the blast zone, resistance was not tested, it was erased. Survival became arbitrary. That did not just kill bodies, it undermined the moral language of war. If death could arrive without confrontation, then the traditional meaning of courage, choosing to face danger, collapsed into a random outcome determined by distance and timing. Even the act of assessment became disorienting. Reports described injuries and symptoms that persisted beyond the immediate blast. Medical teams faced conditions they could not treat with familiar methods. The weapon's effects extended in time, suggesting war could now injure the future, not just the present. These angles converged on a single conclusion. The war was no longer operating within a framework that Japan's military could manage. And as that conclusion spread, deeper perspectives emerged. How leadership interpreted the crisis, what the weapon revealed about American intent, and how the moral logic of resistance could survive a weapon that bypassed the battlefield entirely. After Hiroshima, the top of Japan's command structure fractured further. The army, still focused on a home island's defense, initially struggled to accept the bomb as strategically final. If it was a singular device, endurance might still force negotiation. If it was rare, perhaps the nation could absorb the shock and continue. The Navy, whose experience was already defined by asymmetry and industrial imbalance, was less inclined to treat Hiroshima as an exception. For many naval leaders, the weapon looked like the ultimate expression of a pattern they had watched unfold since 1942. America did not just defeat forces. It outproduced them, outrepaired them, outscaled them. The bomb suggested that scale had now reached a new plateau. For years, Japan had believed American public opinion might resist prolonged casualties. The invasion defense strategy rested partly on this assumption. Impose enough losses and political pressure will force compromise. Atomic power challenged that model. The weapon implied that America could end the war without paying the invasion price. It suggested a willingness to apply a decisive force that bypassed conventional escalation ladders. Japan's leadership began to understand that the enemy might not be trapped into negotiation by casualties, because the enemy might not need to accept those casualties at all. Japanese doctrine had always tied meaning to action, an individual's choice to endure, to fight, to sacrifice. Atomic destruction denied those choices. It did not test a soldier. It eliminated him alongside civilians, children, the elderly, hospitals, schools. War became something done to a population rather than fought against an opposing force. This raised an unbearable implication. Continued resistance might no longer be moral even within Japan's own ethical framework, because it risked inviting repeated annihilation of civilians without any corresponding military effect. The concept of honor became entangled with the prospect of national extinction. In the narrow days between Hiroshima and the next detonation, Japan's military operated inside uncertainty. How many bombs did America have? Could the weapon be repeated? Was Hiroshima an isolated shock, or a preview of a new rhythm of destruction? Then the rhythm revealed itself. A second bomb fell, and almost simultaneously, the Soviet Union entered the war. Two forces, one technological, one geopolitical, closed on Japan at the same time, stripping away the last functional strategy. What followed was not a gradual decline, but a turning point where decisions were no longer about victory, but about survival of the nation itself. August 6, 1945. Morning. Hiroshima. The city is not fully alarmed. It has been spared in recent weeks, and that absence of attack has become its own kind of false normal. Some residents look up at a lone aircraft and return to routine. The war has trained people to measure danger by formations and sirens. At 0815, that measurement becomes useless. A flash, a pressure wave, heat that ignites surfaces and skin. Buildings collapse as if the city's structure has been unplugged. The center becomes a furnace. Communications stop. Military units in the area cannot report because their systems no longer exist. Tokyo receives reports that arrive like fragments from a broken machine. One plane, one bomb. Enormous devastation. The language is inconsistent because the event is inconsistent with experience. At first, some assume exaggerated damage, a conventional raid misread through panic. Then reconnaissance confirms the scale. Hiroshima is a dead zone. Assessment teams sent toward the city confront a landscape that is more absence than ruin. Structures flattened, shadows burned into surfaces, survivors moving through wreckage with injuries that do not behave like ordinary burns. Medical teams are overwhelmed. The disaster is not contained within the moment of blast. It continues, spreading into hospitals and refugee centers through symptoms no one understands yet. Within leadership circles, analysis becomes urgent. If this is a new type of bomb, what is its deliverable frequency? How many does America possess? Is it a one-off demonstration or the beginning of a series? The old strategy, endure bombing, prepare for invasion, impose casualties, still requires time. But Hiroshima threatens time itself. If cities can be erased singly, endurance becomes a calculation in which every day risks irreversible loss. Then, on August 8th, the strategic map tears again. The Soviet Union declares war and attacks Japanese forces in Manchuria. This is not simply another enemy. It removes the last hope of diplomatic mediation and opens a new front that Japan cannot realistically reinforce. The empire is now pressured from two directions: the Pacific, by an enemy with unprecedented weaponry, and the North by a mechanized power that can sever remaining territory and resources. Before that new reality can be processed, August 9th arrives. And with it, proof. Nagasaki is struck. The second bomb answers the question Hiroshima posed. This is not an isolated miracle weapon. It is capability. It can be repeated. And now Japan's military begins to understand, with a clarity that feels like collapse, that the war is ending not by defeat in the field, but by the arrival of a force against which their entire framework of resistance is irrelevant. That understanding pushes the crisis into a final phase where decision moves beyond conventional command and into the highest authority of the state. After Nagasaki, the debate changes shape. It is no longer about whether Japan can fight. It is about whether continued fighting has meaning. Army leaders, many still committed to the invasion defense plan, argue for terms that preserve the imperial system. Their stance is shaped by institutional identity and fear of national humiliation, but also by a belief that surrender without conditions will dismantle the state itself. They seek a path that ends war while preserving continuity. The Navy's position becomes increasingly uncompromising. Its leaders recognize that Japan has lost the ability to influence the war's outcome through military means. The bomb is not a weapon that can be parried. There is no counter-raid, no defense system that can guarantee protection, no industrial route to parity. In a world where an enemy can erase cities at will, the concept of leverage through casualties collapses. Scientific advisors and engineers confirm what the pattern already indicates: atomic weapons are based on processes Japan cannot counter quickly, even in theory. The weapon's immediate effects, blast and heat, cannot be resisted. The longer effects, radiation sickness, introduce a dimension of harm that extends beyond the moment of detonation. Meanwhile, Soviet operations in Manchuria accelerate. Japan's forces there, already overstretched, face a mechanized assault that breaks their lines rapidly. The strategic hope of dividing enemies, of buying time through diplomacy, disappears. This convergence produces an unbearable conclusion. Japan cannot secure its future through continued resistance. It can only risk its extinction. It is within this atmosphere that the emperor intervenes. The decision is framed not as an embrace of defeat, but as an act of national preservation. The war has reached a point where the means to continue will guarantee only destruction. For Japan's military, this is a rupture in authority as much as in strategy. The state is acknowledging that military logic alone can no longer define national survival. The war has become existential, beyond the scope of conventional command. Even then, some officers resist. They attempt to prevent surrender, driven by ideology and institutional loyalty. But their efforts are overtaken by the same reality that overtook the nation. Atomic power has invalidated the structure within which their values were meaningful. Courage cannot change deliverable capacity. Discipline cannot counter physics. When surrender is announced, it is not described as a normal military loss. It is justified by the arrival of a weapon capable of annihilating not just armies, but civilization. Japan's leadership admits, explicitly, that continued war would mean the destruction of the nation. The realization Japan's military has been forced into is stark. The conflict did not end because their final defenses were tested and broken. It ended because the war itself moved beyond the realm where defenses mattered. And once fighting stops, the consequences begin, practical, political, and psychological, revealing what it means for a military culture built on endurance to confront a world where endurance is no longer a strategy. The end does not arrive with marching armies in Tokyo. It arrives with stillness. Orders are transmitted to cease operations. Units stand down. Weapons are secured. In many places, soldiers simply remain in place, waiting for the next instruction that never comes. The institution that has organized Japanese life for years begins to dissolve not in panic, but in silence. For officers, the immediate aftermath is defined by a strange dislocation. They have lived inside a system where readiness is meaning. Now readiness is irrelevant. The war has ended without the final test they expected. No invasion battle on Kyushu, no coastal slaughter that might validate years of preparation. The decisive moment happened elsewhere, instantly, beyond their control. As occupation begins, demobilization is administrative, but the deeper disarmament is conceptual. Doctrines built around decisive engagement lose purpose in a world where a city can be erased without engagement at all. Manuals, training culture, strategic assumptions, everything that connected war to human agency feels outdated. Material reality reinforces this. Cities remain ruined. Transport networks are broken. Production has collapsed. Millions are displaced. Food is scarce. The military cannot claim it preserved the homeland. The homeland has been shattered from the air. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain at the center of this new reality, not only as destroyed cities but as proof that modern war can bypass the battlefield. Medical reports continue to reveal effects that persist beyond blast injuries. Radiation sickness creates a lingering catastrophe that does not obey the timelines of ordinary warfare. War has extended into bodies and years. This produces a shift in thinking among many former officers and planners. The central problem of war is no longer how to win. It is how to avoid a war that cannot be controlled. Japan's military identity, once anchored in sacrifice and endurance, encounters its limit. Endurance without agency is not strategy, it is simply suffering. And as Japan's institutions are reformed under occupation, a deeper conclusion forms. Atomic power has not only ended the war, it has altered the meaning of security and forced Japan to re-enter the world under rules it did not create. In the post-war order, Japan's military is dismantled, but the lesson it learned does not disappear. It moves into policy, memory, and a new national identity shaped by the knowledge of what modern power can do. The post-war constitution renounces war, and while the legal language is political, the underlying recognition is strategic. In the nuclear age, escalation can exceed control. A nation can be destroyed without conquest. The logic that once defined military success, holding territory, defeating armies, becomes secondary to preventing annihilation. Former officers and thinkers attempt to explain the end. Some emphasize industrial imbalance and the blockade. Others focus on Soviet entry and the collapse of diplomatic options. But again and again, the bomb returns as the clearest symbol of finality. It represents a new kind of decision, one that does not require prolonged campaigns or incremental advantage. Atomic power changes the relationship between time and war. Conventional wars unfold. Nuclear war threatens to conclude. Strategy becomes less about movement and more about restraint, signaling, deterrence. Concepts that shift the center of warfare away from soldiers and toward systems. Japan's experience becomes globally influential because it is unique, a state forced to confront nuclear reality, not as theory, but as lived history. Hiroshima and Nagasaki become reference points not only for tragedy, but for strategic transformation. They show that modern war can target civilization directly, that civilians can become the decisive terrain. This knowledge alters how Japan positions itself in the world. Security is no longer framed as expansion or decisive battle. It is framed as stability, alliance, and prevention. The country becomes a symbol of what happens when war crosses into a domain where human courage cannot restore control. The deeper realization is grim, but clear. The atomic bomb did not merely defeat Japan's military. It revealed the limits of military logic itself. It showed that the ultimate power of modern states might not lie in battlefield skill, but in scientific mobilization and industrial capacity. Forces that can redefine the meaning of conflict overnight. And from that point forward, Japan's relationship with war is shaped by a boundary written into history by two cities and two flashes of light. Once atomic power exists, the central question of warfare is no longer how far a nation will go to win, but how far humanity can go before winning becomes indistinguishable from ruin. That is the final meaning of what Japan's military realized, because it was forced to realize it first. Atomic power did not arrive as a new tactic. It arrived as a new reality. For Japan's military, the bomb was not simply the strongest weapon used against it. It was the moment when the rules that had guided war for centuries stopped matching the world. Endurance, sacrifice, discipline. These had always been framed as forces that could shape outcomes. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki revealed a boundary where outcomes could be decided without confrontation, without sequence, without the time required for courage to matter. This did not erase bravery. It made bravery insufficient. The deepest shock was not the scale of destruction alone. It was the collapse of agency. In a conventional war, a nation can still imagine leverage, through battlefield success, through negotiated terms, through the ability to impose costs. Atomic power threatened to erase leverage entirely. If the weapon could be repeated, then resistance might not produce bargaining power. It might only produce absence. That knowledge changed the nature of strategic thought. The center of war moved away from the battlefield and toward the existence of society itself. Victory became inseparable from restraint. Security became less about defeating an enemy and more about ensuring the conditions of catastrophe never returned. Japan's military realized this at the moment it lost the ability to act on it. That is what makes the lesson so heavy. The war ended not only because Japan was exhausted, not only because the Soviet Union entered, not only because the blockade strangled its economy, but because atomic power revealed a future where war could outpace human control. And once that future was visible, the old world could not be restored. The age of endurance ended in silence, and the age of restraint began, not as an ideal, but as a necessity.